My name's Travis Helms. I am the session chair for this session. Our next speaker is Mr. Gregory Wrightstone. The title of his talk is Unusual and Unprecedented Warming. What do geologic and human history tell us? And I'm going to let you know that you might not agree with Mr. Wrightstone's opinions. We are not in the business here of censoring science. And so we welcome any and all viewpoints. And this talk should give you plenty of things to think about. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Wrightstone. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Gregory Wrightstone here. I'm talking to you today from beautiful Bluffton, South Carolina, where I'm on a working holiday, researching, writing material for my new book. The title is A Very Convenient Warming, Climate, CO2 and Humanity. And our presentation today on unusual and unprecedented warming is drawn from the first section of that book. So let's get right into it here. And again, the title of the talk today is Unusual and Unprecedented Warming. What do geologic and human history tell us? When we look at the great climate debate, and yes, Virginia, there is a climate debate, I've identified two primary issues that really determine or are impactful in this debate. The first part of this is our current warming that we've seen over the last several hundred years combined with increasing CO2, is it leading to catastrophic consequences? Or is it leading is the warming, the modest warming and the increase in CO2 leading to beneficial consequences to Earth and humanity? We're not going to go into that today. For today, we're going to deal with unusual and unprecedented warming. And this is important to the debate. If the Earth's temperature has experienced unusual and unprecedented warming over the last 100 or 150 years, something not seen in thousands of years, that would then provide strong support for those that claim that man's increasing greenhouse gases and emissions are driving what they see as dangerous temperature increases. And so this would be strong support. Unusual and unprecedented warming would be strong support for man-made driven warming. If on the other hand, what we view and we look at things in the geologic history of the last several thousand years, and we find that other warming periods are as warm or warmer than what we're seeing here in the 20th and early 21st century, well, then that would provide strong support for those that say that our current warming is just one more repeated cycle of warming and cooling that we've been going through since the dawn of time. So this is really a big, important issue for this unusual and unprecedented warming. And to tell you why, we're going to focus here today mostly comparing modern warming, our current warming trend, versus the medieval warming period, which was from the years 850 or so to 1250 AD, and also a little bit in the Little Ice Age, which went from 1250 to about 1850. In the first United Nations assessment report on Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I'll just mention here, I was recently accepted to be what they call an expert reviewer for the latest IPCC panel, the AR6. But in that first IPCC report, they stated that there were other warm periods over the last several thousand years, warmer than what we are today, and included this chart here, showing those warm periods, showing that the Holocene, dating back to the end of the last ice age, much of that was warmer than we are today. And in this chart by Hubert Lamb, the father of modern climatology, again, we saw, according to this first assessment report, they represented the medieval warm period was warmer than we are today. We had a very warm medieval warm period, a very cool Little Ice Age, and then recovery in warming coming out of that horrifically cold part of the Little Ice Age. Those that represent man-made driven catastrophic warming, Dr. Michael Mann, will get into him in just a moment, but Jonathan, they needed to get rid of the medieval warm period. If the medieval warm period existed and was global and was warmer than today, that would deal a death blow to their notion of man-made catastrophic warming. And we know that because Jonathan Overpeck in the ClimateGate emails revealed that he would like to deal a mortal blow to the medieval warm period. And here's why. If we take a look at a reconstructed temperature here by Moberg in red, and then compare it to atmospheric carbon dioxide that we've seen dating back 1,000 years, we see that we had this strong medieval warm period, but it wasn't driven by CO2. It was driven by some natural force, whatever that is. Is it the sun? Is it planetary influence, the wobble of the earth? It certainly wasn't carbon dioxide driven. They needed to get rid of the medieval warm period. They needed to erase the medieval warm period, and that was accomplished by papers by Dr. Michael Mann from Penn State in 1998 and 99. It's called the hockey stick, probably the most impactful climatological study ever created. And it was featured in the third IPCC report. The primary objections when this was first published was that man used proxy data in blue here, but then simply pasted on instrumental data that included satellite and thermometer data. So what he did was mixed apples and oranges. That was the first red flag that came up, was a mixing of apples and oranges, pasting. And it's been done quite commonly since. It's dangerous because the proxy data tends to, if you will, in the COVID era, it kind of flattens the curve. The proxy data doesn't pick up the highest highs or the lowest lows. We're going to talk quite a bit about Michael Mann and the real problems he had with the science, because it's important for you to understand the many problems and scientifically questionable aspects that went into creation of this hockey stick. My favorite description of Michael Mann and his hockey stick was by acerbic commentator Mark Stein, who said that the hockey stick is a reconstruction of temperature based on proxies with two problems: the reconstruction and the proxies. Other than that, you can take it to the bank, and that's so true. We're going to walk through some of these. I deal with this in great detail in my upcoming new book, and if you read this and are not outraged about the scientific missteps that we went through, that Michael Mann went through to create this, you will be outraged. 3 years after publication, several years, Steve McIntyre and Ross McKittrick published a devastating review of the hockey stick. And again, this was two papers they published in 2003 and 2005. According to them, Michael Mann's hockey stick contains collation errors, lots of truncations of data. Other places, Mann took and just extrapolated fabricated data into areas just to populate it with completely made up data. He used obsolete data when new data and better data was available. Lots of geographical location errors. And the one thing we'll talk right now, it's an improper use of what's called principal component analysis. This is the statistical technique that is used to go through large amounts of data and find what the trends are that might be hiding in that data. McIntyre and McKittrick's conclusion on this was that the hockey stick is primarily an artifact of poor data handling, obsolete data, and incorrect calculation of principal components. This was confirmed several years later in congressional testimony, where the statisticians that the Congress had employed agreed with McIntyre's conclusions on the inappropriateness of this data manipulation that he did and the analysis of the statistics. One of the first things that stuck out, again, it's called principal component analysis, a statistical technique. Michael Mann in his paper in 1998-99 stated that he used conventional statistical techniques and conventional principal component analysis. He did not. He did use principal component analysis for statistics, but he used an unusual and unacceptable method part of the process is called centering, and that's the correct spelling there. He used a process called short centering, and this method introduces hockey sticks where there are none in there. An example here is McIntyre took a look at the Australia data set. One of the things that's interesting here, we talked earlier about truncation of data. This is one example of that. you'll notice that there's 125 years of data missing from the, Michael Mann started his analysis in 1750, but the actual data set went back to 1625. But that's not the point of this chart. The point of this chart is that Mann's reconstruction of temperature at the top shows a strong hockey stick shape and strong warming in the 20th century. A reconstruction using conventional principal component analysis shows no hockey stick at all. And he saw this time and time and time again. Here's another one from the North American Tree Ring Network, which dominated Mann's North American analysis. Again, Mann's use of statistics created and mined this hockey stick for the North American Tree Ring Network. You can see at the top a strong hockey stick shape, significant warming in the 20th century, using conventional principal component analysis. The basic conventional statistical analysis of this again shows no hockey stick shape, no unusual, no unprecedented warming. And again, this McIntyre found this time after time after time. In fact, he came up with an input, just random sets of numbers to create hockey sticks that would show up. A really, really significant problem that should discredit the entire study was his strong reliance on tree ring data. And it wasn't just any tree ring data. It was primarily a type of tree called a bristlecone pine that occurred from the southwest of Pennsylvania, and to a lesser extent, some cedars from the Gaspé Peninsula in Canada. In fact, of the 15 heavily weighted series, 13 of them were from a study of bristlecone pines. So we have this strong reliance of the hockey stick relying on this bristlecone pine data. Big problem though. The authors of the study, Graybill and Idso, attributed the tree ring growth and tree ring density increase to increasing CO2 content. In other words, the increases in CO2 were driving tree growth. Now, it is true that tree rings can be used effectively for temperature. If you take trees in the high alpine areas, high latitude areas, when it's warmer, they should grow faster. But in this case, Idso and Graybill spent most of their study just documenting that it's not temperature related. So this is really, really important. Let's just to make sure you understand. We have a hockey stick created by Dr. Michael Mann that's driving policy studies in the Green New Deal where we might spend $100 trillion in 10 years, based primarily on a lot of this work. The study that created the hockey stick is based on bristlecone pines. The authors of that study they stated categorically, they said their data should not be used in temperature reconstructions, but use it, he did. We see the same use of this same bristlecone pine data in study after study after study. And why is that? Because it shows a great 20th century warming and a great hockey stick shape. Another problem with tree ring data is what's called the divergence problem. And in the divergence problem, that means that we have a pretty good correlation. If you're going to use a proxy, you want to make sure you have a good correlation between what the proxy is telling you and what the measured temperature is. And for tree rings, there was a pretty good correlation from the mid 1800s up until the late 20th century. But at that point, it broke down and started diverging. It's called the divergence problem. The black line here is tree ring growth, which started going down in 1960, which caused a real problem. Temperature kept going up, tree ring growth went down. It wasn't fitting the narrative. So what did they do? Ken Britha, the father of this divergence problem, said, well, there must be something going on we just don't know about. And so their solution was just to truncate that data. And that's how it's been handled from now on, from that point on, from about year 2000 on, they would just truncate the later part of the tree ring growth. And this tree ring growth is used for many of the reconstructions of temperature. In fact, there's a famous line in the ClimateGate email where one of the researchers said, I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding the real temperatures. That means Mike being Michael Mann, of deleting the last part of the data and just pasting on instrumental data from 1960 for Keith's to hide the decline. Hide the decline means the decline in tree ring growth. We also saw that a lot of the data sets, we saw one earlier where data was just truncated. For example, here's another one. This is the Central England temperature record that Mann used. He deleted the first 70 years of data. And why is that important? Because that went back to the worst of the cold of the Little Ice Age. He just deleted it and did not use it, which helped to serve to erase the Little Ice Age in his reconstruction. This should not go on in scientific research. If you're going to delete something, it should be stated in the paper and stated why. Here's another example. While there were only 25 years removed in this particular case, this is the Central Europe temperature record. It went back to the middle of the medieval warm period, and it captured the highest temperature of that portion of the record. Yet Mann deleted that. Once again, serving to help to erase the warming of the medieval warm period. So why did it take a retired mining engineer in McIntyre to determine all these huge errors? And we've only touched really on the surface here of the many, many, many errors within the Mann study. There was a congressional study on this, and then the National Academy of Sciences also did an investigation of this. Both of them concluded that McIntyre was correct in his analysis and the mistakes within Mann, 1998 and 99. Why is that? Why did no one else go through this? And I'll say that Powell review has replaced peer review for much of the science, particularly in climate. Michael Mann is now the most powerful climate scientist in the world. He was the primary lead author of the third report that featured his hockey stick graph. Money flows through him. He sits on boards. He reviews papers. And what we have here are the top 45 published paleotemperature scientists and their connection to Michael Mann. So there's a strong disincentive to criticize Mann or his methods by these people. You might be risking your funding if you do that. And again, this came from the Wegman report, the U.S. Congressional Wegman report that reported that these are, it's basically a small clique of scientists approving each other's papers. Since the publication, and again, I'll just state that, again, we've just touched on some of the problems with Michael Mann in his paper, and it's really important to understand just how bad the science was with this. Since Michael Mann published, there have been a number of papers that have been published. They're called replication studies. These are papers that have replicated, if you will, the hockey stick. They've replicated his idea of 2,000 years or 1,900 years of cooling temperatures, and then it got really hot in the 20th century. The biggest of this and the most well-known is called the Pages 2K network. It's their first publications. Pages 2K stands for Past Global Changes 2,000 Years. Basically, they've acted as a de facto wing of the hockey team to promote his vision of unusual and unprecedented warming. Their first report was published in 2013 to great hoorah in the press. You probably don't remember, but you've seen things like this. They've published two since then with headlines blaring, "Earth is warming at an unprecedented rate. We haven't seen anything like this in 2,000 years. You know, be alarmed." So let's take a look at this Pages 2K network and their claim of unusual and unprecedented warming for 2,000 years. This is their summary from their publication in 2013, showing unusual and unprecedented warming in the 20th century, a strong hockey stick shape. The red here again is splicing the thermometer data from Hadley Climate Research Unit onto this to accentuate the modern warming. This particular study looked at 7 continent-wide areas. They analyzed Europe, Asia, Antarctic, the the main continents. They did not look at Africa. So I'm showing you here 6 of them. There was only one that showed unusual and unprecedented warming. There was only one that showed that and a strong hockey stick shape. And that was the Arctic data, which we'll look at. So I'm going to have you take a look at this. And I want to ask you, do you see anything unusual or unprecedented about the warming of the last 100 years since the 20th century? Sure, we've had warming. That's unquestioned. But doesn't it look a lot like what we've seen in the past? And this actually came from that. This is their work, their study. We can look at this and see. And in fact, if we look at the Antarctic, of course, it's been a long-term declining temperature. So these were the 6, showed nothing unusual, nothing unprecedented. The 7th was the Arctic data. And again, we're just going to look time after time as I'm looking into a lot of these studies, we just find huge mistakes that drive, they all seem to reduce the warming of the medieval warm period and increase the temperature of the Little Ice Age. In this case, the Arctic reconstruction had 2 huge errors that were driving the warming of the 20th century. The first was Icelandic data. The original authors indicated that we had a very warm medieval warm period, but the pages 2K used actually ended up using their information upside down, and they got it exactly backwards. Instead of what they were saying was a very cold medieval warm period, it was an exceptionally warm medieval warm period from that same data. The second was Greenland lake data that's been contaminated by modern agricultural practices. The authors of the study said, do not use this for temperature reconstruction because these agricultural processes have contaminated the lake sediment and we're giving us a false signal. You can see here that the, what I'm calling the Viking bump is, that was when Eric the Red actually settled along this lake in the 10th century. And there was a bit of farming that they did that contributed to the lake sediment that caused a false rise in that. And then you can see the acceleration due to modern farming practices. Again, these two drove their analysis for the Arctic, which then drove the final analysis for the whole Pages 2K 2013 chart. The Pages 2K network admitted their problems, admitted their mistakes. There were more than just those, some very serious. They published what's called a corrigendum or a correction the following year. The original Arctic chart that they presented, which showing unprecedented warming, which led to all the headlines, is shown at the top. It shows warming in the 20th century and unprecedented warming not seen in 2,000 years. Well, when they used the correct data, the chart is, this chart on the bottom is their corrected chart for the Arctic. Yes, we're seeing 20th century warming, but we're not seeing anything unusual compared to the Roman warm period or the medieval warm period. In fact, those periods, both in their corrected version, were warmer than we are today. The other thing of note is that nearly all of the warming, if you notice, for modern warming took place between the 19th century and the 1940s, long before we started adding prodigious amounts of CO2 to the atmosphere. So this is the final corrected version for the Pages 2013. Remember those charts, the newspaper headlines that were blaring, unusual warming, danger, danger. We've not seen anything like this in 2,000 years. Well, it turns out by looking at this chart, this is the corrected one. The only thing really unusual is the extreme cold of the Little Ice Age. And I think a strong argument can be made that our modern warming, according to Pages 2K, is simply a recovery of the normal temperatures that we've seen in the late Holocene area, dating back 2,000 years. That actually our warming today is just getting us back to what might be normal Holocene temperatures, getting us out of the horrifically cold of the Little Ice Age. And we see this time after time. I've gone through, and again in the book, my new book coming up, I've gone through the later Pages 2K publications, you'll find that many of these have many of the same errors that we had before. We'll take a look now at CO2 and temperature through geologic time. This is the Central England temperature record, which is the longest continuous thermometer record, versus carbon emissions. We can see that we've had almost or more than 300 years of warming. And at this chart, looking at this, there sure doesn't look like any correlation between carbon emissions and temperature rise. We've seen this chart before, again, a reconstruction by Moberg of 1,000 years of temperature, again showing a comparison of CO2 and again the medieval warm period warming. It was warmer than today with a very low, actually historically low CO2 levels in the range of 280 parts per million, 275 compared to over 400 today. And then looking at a little bit bigger picture, looking back through the Holocene, back 8,000 years, we've seen that generally temperature has been in decline. It's been in fits and starts, warming and cooling, but the overall trend has really been down. But all the while, CO2 during this time through the Holocene has increased. The other thing that's stated is the rate of warming is unusual and unprecedented. Again, we look at the Central England temperature record, the early recovery out of the Little Ice Age, the rate of warming increased at 0.8 of a degree centigrade per decade. Our 20th century warming is less than 10% of that. So the rate of warming is not unusual. It's not unprecedented. And if we look at the Greenland data, the other 9 warming periods prior to our current period, we look at them, 5 of them had higher rates of warming than what our current warm period does. So again, the rate of warming is not unusual. It's not unprecedented. Craig Lowley decided he did not. There's a lot of problems with tree ring data. Most of the reconstructions use that. He looked at other proxy data and excluded tree ring data to come up with this analysis, showing a very warm medieval warm period, a very cold Little Ice Age, and then recovery coming back in our current time. And then if we look at, we often hear of this consensus of science. Dr. Craig Idso and his team did what was called the Medieval Warm Project. They looked at thousands of studies that dealt with medieval warming, if it was warmer or colder, and found that the vast majority of these studies actually measured that the medieval warm period was significantly warmer than our current temperatures. And finally, Dr. Christian Leuning has an ongoing project here. The red dots concerning paleoclimate data, the red drips here are studies that indicate whether that the medieval warm period was warmer than today. The blue indicate that the medieval warm period was cooler than today. So this is just a visual representation of just how many studies conclude worldwide, globally, that period of time during the High Middle Ages was warmer than today. We also see that one of the things I love, and I'm into that right in this portion of the book, the relationship between the rise and fall of temperature and the rise and fall of civilizations. We see the time and time again that as temperatures warm, these warming periods, the Minoan warm period, the Roman warm period, the medieval warm period, was associated primarily with the rise of great civilizations and empires. The Earth's ecosystems and humanity profited and benefited. And before climate science became politicized, each one of those warm periods were called climate optima, because both the Earth's ecosystems and the human condition prospered during those times. The High Middle Ages were associated with the medieval warm period. The onset of the Little Ice Age led to glacial advances, crop failure, pestilence, famine, and death. We see that during each one of the cold periods. It's just opposite of what we're being told. Fear the cold. We're going to end up here. I've just finished this section up in my book. It's fascinating, correlating the climate and temperature to the witch hunts of the late Middle Ages in Europe. As the medieval warm period ended, cold set in, crops began to fail, people started dying, and they blamed it on weather causing witches. And in fact, in the 14th century, the Pope, Innocent VII, issued a papal bull that said, yes, there are weather-causing witches, and if you find them, you need to kill them. And they did. This is a chart at the top showing the number of witches killed per decade. And below that is a chart showing extremely cold months during the winter. And it was fascinating. Around 1500, it warmed up again, and crops came back. Food was bountiful. And why was that? They killed all the witches. That's what they said. Oh, we did really good. But then that only lasted for 4 decades, and then it really started getting cold, and that's when the real terrible witch hunts, estimated as high as 50,000 witches, supposed witches, were killed during that 300-year period. And I'm going to be wrapping up here. I just want to announce today, just as on a personal note, I'll be joining the CO2 Coalition at the end of the year as their executive director, a team of some of the top atmospheric physicists, atmospheric scientists, climatologists. So I'm proud to be joining them and be leading that. And I'll just wrap up here by just want to renew what I believe about climate change and my theory, which is that I think we need to use all of Earth's resources for the betterment of mankind and do it as good stewards.